Monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, saturated fats, and trans fats. We've all heard of them. But do you know much of what you've heard and thought was based on hard science isn't? Welcome back to the Busy Keto Life channel, where we put science back into nutrition and give you the tools you need to succeed at all your keto goals. Today, I'm going to give you the facts you need to make the right decisions for yourself concerning dietary fat. Fats. Just the word can conjure up uncomfortable feelings because of the way most of us have been programmed to think about fats over the last 50 years. Not only have we been programmed with overwhelmingly negative information about dietary fat, but that programming has included the message that the information being provided to us is based on incredible scientific findings. But is either part of that message true? The message that dietary fat is bad, in fact, that dietary fat, if high enough, will kill you, was started by the egomaniacal, corrupt physiologist Ancel Keys roughly 60 years ago. In another video entitled, quote, "The Number One Lie Damaging Your Family's Health," I reveal how Keys manipulated his data and scammed the entire Western world concerning the alleged consequences of dietary fat, saturated fat in particular. I'll put a link to that video in the description section below. When we talk about monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, saturated, and trans fats, why does it matter? Why is that conversation important? It's important because virtually the entire conversation about dietary fat from the early 60s until today has been within the construct of life and death. Eat this and you'll be healthy and avoid these terrible consequences. But eat that and you'll get any number of afflictions, the most dramatic of which being heart disease. Pretty important stuff, if it were factual. Do you know research proves you'll decrease your chance of getting heart disease if most of the fat you consume is polyunsaturated? But do you know research also proves that eating mostly polyunsaturated fat increases your chances of getting heart disease? Isn't that great? If your dietary fat is primarily polyunsaturated, you stand a good chance of avoiding heart disease, or a good chance of getting heart disease, depending on which study you look at. Perhaps this should tell us that fat isn't actually the issue at all, or perhaps this should tell us the way research has been approached isn't meaningful, or perhaps it should tell us the researchers have rectal cranial inversion, or all three. If you followed me for any length of time, you know I don't approach these issues as do a majority of expositors. I could waste your time reviewing all the data on each form of fat. You'd feel like you just learned a lot, but in truth, you'd then simply be as ill-informed as everyone else. Let's not do that. You don't need me to vomit technical data at you that you can read for yourself on the internet. My value is that I cut through all the crap to bring you what others don't, to bring you what really matters. So let's talk about what really matters. Our bodies are pretty fantastic. The body is way smarter than any doctor or medical researcher. If you read enough research, as I have, what you come to understand is that what we don't know about the human body and all the amazing things it does is far greater than what we do know. But no one ever impressed the public, got an article published in a respected journal, or got a seat on a prestigious board or panel by talking about how little we know. What we do know is that heart disease was virtually unknown before the industrial age. When you read articles on the history of heart disease, you find that what is presumed to be heart disease based on descriptions written in the very late 1800s, almost into the 20th century, is the first modern record of heart disease and heart attack. What you then find is historians going all the way back to Plato and referencing the Egyptian dynasties. So in big round numbers, we've got a 2,500-year gap between the first modern reference and what we're assuming are references to heart disease made 2,500 years earlier. There's virtually nothing in between. People can argue about exact dates and what one historical record or another may have been describing, but what is inarguably true is that heart disease and heart attack were virtually unheard of before the beginning of the 20th century. That reality is why, starting in the late 1920s, doctors in America's urban centers started becoming concerned about an incredibly rare phenomenon that seemed to be increasing: heart attacks. As the frequency of heart attacks increased dramatically, by the mid-1940s, heart attacks were being considered as serious as communicable disease epidemics. Why was heart disease and heart attacks virtually unknown until the beginning of the 20th century? And at that time, remained essentially unknown outside the big urban centers. Two things occurred which are foundational to the dramatic increase in heart disease and heart attack. First was the discovery of a process to stabilize non-stable oils. The process is known as hydrogenation. By hydrogenation, various oils could be thickened to the consistency of lard and perform just like lard in cooking. Products having been altered by that process first appeared in Europe in the late 1890s and showed up in the US starting in 1911. Are we connecting the timelines? You may have heard of a product called Crisco shortening by a little company called Procter & Gamble, who held the US patent. Crisco hit US stores in 1911, and from then onward, the use of Crisco grew exponentially in US urban centers where people couldn't create their own cooking fat, such as lard. They could, of course, buy lard at the store, but Crisco was cheaper and accomplished the exact same job in the exact same manner. It was even available in a 50-pound tin. But there's a little something you need to know. The fat in hydrogenated oil is known as man-made trans fat, the only type of fat to actually have been proven to cause heart disease. But of course, that wouldn't be proven for another 70 years. The second development was the ability to extract oil from nuts, seeds, and grains on an industrial scale. Why do I say nuts, seeds, and grains? Because almost every oil that we refer to as vegetable oil is actually from a nut, seed, or grain, not vegetables. That includes corn oil. While the whole corn, such as when you grab it off the plate as corn on the cob, is considered a vegetable, the kernels, once separated from the cob, is considered a grain. These nut, seed, and grain oils, marketed as vegetable oil, are the primary source of monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. So let me ask you a question. Given the limitations of geography in any one locale and taking into account the short harvest season, how much fat from oil within nuts, seeds, and grains do you imagine the average human being consumed prior to the Industrial Revolution? If you said very little, you'd be right. On the other hand, how prevalent and available are those oils today? They're available in abundance, and Americans consume exponentially more of the fat from these nuts, seeds, and grain oils than did our ancestors. Or phrased another way, Americans eat many times in excess of the amount our bodies were ever intended to consume. And there's a cost for that, as you'll see. Let me connect those two developments for you. The extraction of oil from nuts, seeds, and grains included the oil from cotton seeds. Cotton seeds are just what the name implies, the seeds of a cotton plant. As you can imagine, in nature, man would rarely, if ever, eat cotton seeds, so he would rarely, if ever, ingest the oils within the cotton seeds. But all that changed with the technology for extracting oil from nuts, seeds, and grains. Want to guess which oil was used to manufacture Crisco? If you said cottonseed, you'd be right. In other words, the two developments, taken together, allowed Procter & Gamble to take a seed oil man would not ordinarily eat, convert it from a liquid oil to a solid using the newly created hydrogenation process, thus converting the fat within the seed oil into trans fat, which we today know is a leading cause of heart disease. And Crisco was wildly successful. You could find it in any kitchen of just about every urban and suburban household in America by the 1940s. Unsurprisingly, those were also the households that were experiencing the new epidemic of heart attacks. Then came margarine. Same story as Crisco, except instead of replacing lard, it was intended to replace butter. And an entire nation was told it was safe. In fact, it was pitched as being heart healthy, yet the exact same hydrogenation process used for Crisco was used to create trans fat in margarine. And heart attacks just kept increasing, while the experts told us it was the fault of saturated fat. You know, the primary fat our ancestors ate and didn't have heart disease or heart attacks. Here's a fun fact. If we considered all of human history to have taken place within 1 year, humans have only been farming and eating grain since yesterday. So what was the primary food source for the other 364 days of human history? It was primarily animal meat and animal byproducts, things like milk and cheese. You could raise herd animals if you lived in one place, as well as move with them if you were nomadic. So animals and animal byproducts were the prime food source. And guess what? Animal meat has all four kinds of fats in varying quantity. Dairy, which anthropologists tell us has been with us since at least 4000 BC and likely earlier than 6000 BC, is predominantly saturated fat. And no one was having heart attacks. Here's a look at the percentage of each of the three primary types of fat in beef. Red means saturated, purple is monounsaturated, and green is polyunsaturated. And here's a look at the same 3 fats in a couple of today's common dairy products. You'll note I said meat and dairy have all 4 kinds of fats. Does that mean they contain trans fat? Yes, the meat and dairy from ruminant animals, those with more than one stomach, have trans fat in their meat and milk. The amount rarely exceeds 5%, and it's naturally occurring trans fat, which has a different molecular structure than man-made trans fat. Despite substantial research, there is no evidence that naturally occurring trans fat causes any health problems, and it's likely beneficial to our body. After all, our ancestors ate copious amounts of meat from ruminant animals and consumed their milk and other dairy byproducts with no heart disease or heart attacks. A brief word about man-made trans fat. The universal consensus from research around the world is that man-made trans fat promotes heart disease. Big time. Most Western nations have now banned it in food products. Of course, the United States government, always the last to act in such matters, doesn't require an end to trans fat in the food supply until January 1st, 2020. So what's the takeaway from all this? First, and to state it bluntly, we need to acknowledge the dietary fat-related advice from researchers, the medical community, and the United States government was about as wrong can get. What they were telling us to eat to protect ourselves from heart disease and heart attack was actually increasing both dramatically. Second, when it comes to our health, we cannot rely on the experts. Ancel Keys and those who blindly supported his corrupt hypothesis are likely responsible for killing more people in the Western world than war. When the experts get it that wrong, the only sane option is to make our decisions based on common sense. In this case, common sense would be that heart attack was virtually unheard of when we ate a lot of saturated fat, but increased dramatically when we cut back on saturated fat and started eating more oil from nuts, seeds, and grains. And for the record, many Americans did see that and reject the government's nutritional advice, living long and healthy lives. Third, the story of products like Crisco and margarine are cautionary tales. Just because technology allows us to consume something never before consumed in any meaningful quantity doesn't mean we should. In this case, with the help of government and the medical community, Americans deteriorated their own health and died early by the millions from consuming food in both form and quantity unavailable to our ancestors. As I said, a cautionary tale to carry with us into the future. Fourth, heart disease and most other serious health conditions attributed to dietary fat by the liars has nothing to do with dietary fat. Well, sort of. In reality, the cause of heart disease and most other malignant illnesses is rooted in inflammation. By that I mean internal inflammation within the body, inflammation we can't see and don't know it's occurring. One of the primary causes of inflammation is excess omega-6 in our diet. I'll go into detail on omega-6 and the other omega series of fatty acids in another video, but for today, let me just say that omega-6 and omega-3 are essential fatty acids our bodies must have to be healthy. But there's a problem. The generally accepted healthy ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is 4:1. By some estimates, the ratio consumed by Americans today is 16:1. In other words, Americans eat dramatically more omega-6 than the body wants or needs, and that has been proven to cause inflammation, one of the primary causes of heart disease and most other malignant illnesses. At this point, you may be wondering what the leading source of omega-6 is in the American diet. As you may have surmised, a huge source of omega-6 is the oil from nuts, seeds, and grains, known on your grocery store shelf as vegetable oil. In other words, the very thing experts have been telling us to consume for the last 40 years to be heart healthy is exactly the thing that causes inflammation, which is the underlying cause of heart disease and heart attacks. I know I've shot information at you out of a fire hose today. I apologize for that. The bottom line is that all naturally occurring dietary fat is good and healthy for you, the reviled saturated fat in particular. But if we want to be healthy, we need to consume our dietary fat from the same sources as did our ancestors and stop listening to the experts who've been literally killing us with their horrifically bad advice. 2 final notes. First, what about those who say that high saturated fat intake raises cholesterol and that leads to heart attack? In 1960, almost 60 years ago, scientist George Mann, working for the National Institutes of Health, proved that saturated fat has nothing to do with heart disease. In an interview many years later, Mann stated the following concerning his findings, quote, "That went over like a wet blanket with my superiors at the National Institutes of Health because it was contrary to what they wanted us to find. They wouldn't let us publish that data." And second, despite the last 50 years of societal programming, there is no causal link between cholesterol and heart attack. The reason so many Americans believe there is such a link is because of the lies of people like Ansel Keys and the suppression of factual data, such as that developed by George Mann. And lastly, unrelated directly to the issue of dietary fat, please slash your carbohydrate intake. While I won't get into why most carbs are a large part of America's health crisis, I do want to mention that eating the proper amount of dietary fat in conjunction with today's level of carb intake is a deadly combination. And it's not the fat that's the problem, it's the carbs. Go for the fat, dump the carbs. That's the way to live a long and healthy life. If you found this video compelling, please take a moment and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you'll never miss any of this valuable information. And please, share the hell out of it on whatever social media platform you use. Shouldn't everyone know this information? And to my fellow keto practitioners, if you're doing the proper 80-15-5 macro ratio, you're already living a wonderfully healthy lifestyle, and you will be one of those who live a long and healthy life. Until next time, keto on.